In previous episodes, we spoke about the factors that enabled the West to transform itself from a society that was remarkably similar to the world's other civilized societies to a society radically different from every other society in the world, past and present. In this episode, we'll be discussing why the factors that enabled the West's transformation had absolutely no effect on Islamic society, despite its being at the time more highly developed, more cosmopolitan, more educated, much wealthier, and militarily more powerful than the West. Instead, Islam's success, prosperity, and power slowly unraveled. It lost its economic and military preeminence, and all because of an ivory-tower dispute among its theologians. Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. First, some background about Islam, based on the standard Islamic narrative. Sometime in the early 7th century CE, an illiterate merchant named Muhammad in the Arabian desert town of Mecca announced that he had been receiving prophecies from the angel Gabriel. Over time, he collected a group of followers, and because he spoke out against Mecca's polytheistic religion, his group was forced to flee to Yathrib, an oasis to the north, where his preaching attracted more followers. A decade later, now calling themselves Muslims, they returned to conquer Mecca and establish a new, strictly monotheistic religion, Islam, based on Muhammad's revelations, which were eventually recorded in Islam's holy book, the Qur'an. Muhammad united the Arabian tribes under the banner of Islam, and within only a century of his death, in 632, the Muslims had conquered a vast empire, ruled by a caliph from their prophet Muhammad's family, stretching from Iberia in the west to India and the borders of China in the east, a stunning and unprecedented conquest which Muslims viewed as a reward for their devotion to their God, whom they called Allah. Islam is centered on three fundamental claims. Their prophet Muhammad was the last of God's prophets, the seal of prophecy. There were prophets before Muhammad, for example, Moses and Jesus, but there will be no more prophets after Muhammad. The Qur'an is an exact word-for-word record of Muhammad's prophecies, as dictated to him by the angel Gabriel, and passed down orally after his death in a reliable chain, and later committed to writing. The Hadith, the collected sayings of Muhammad and the events of his life, are authoritative records of what Muhammad said and did, providing guidance for Muslims on how they should speak and act, also passed down orally after his death in a reliable chain, and later committed to writing. By the way, Allah is the Arabic word for God, and was used by Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews as well as by Muslims. The Muslim Arab conquerors were illiterate, warlike tribesmen who encountered in their newly conquered territories a settled, highly cultured world with long-established religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism, and literary traditions going back more than 1,000 years. The Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire, whose eastern territories the Muslim conquered, had preserved classical literature as well as many Persian and Indian books, which had been translated into the local languages by the time the Muslims arrived. Soon, these books were being translated into Arabic as well, and by the 9th century, the Islamic Caliphate had become a flourishing center of high culture. Theology, philosophy, medicine, the sciences, all bloomed. Extensive trade networks brought the Caliphate great wealth, as shown by the discovery of thousands of its mid-10th century coins in far-off Sweden. The Islamic lands imported timber from Africa and Southeast Asia, silk and paper from China, spices, jewels, and the Hindu decimal notation from India, some of which they traded on to Europe, from which it imported mostly slaves. The caliphs accumulated vast libraries, Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809, sent to Constantinople for books, and his son al-Mamun established the House of Wisdom, a public academy and library in the new capital of Baghdad. The intellectual atmosphere of 10th century Baghdad is vividly displayed in the account of Abu Ammar, a Muslim visitor who told with horror of the theological discussions he witnessed there. At the first meeting I attended, there were present not only members of all Orthodox and unorthodox Muslim sects, but also unbelievers, Magians, materialists, atheists, Jews, Christians, unbelievers of every sort. Each sect had its own chief to defend the views he professed. And whenever one of these leaders entered the hall, all would rise respectfully, and none would take their seat until his chief was seated. When everyone seemed to have arrived, one of the unbelievers rose to speak. "We are gathered to reason together," he said, "and you all know the rules. You Muslims may not oppose us with arguments from your book or on the authority of your prophet, for we do not believe in either. Each of us must therefore limit himself to arguments based on human reason." All applauded these words. "You can understand," said Abu Umar, "that after hearing such things, I did not go back to that gathering. I was invited to another, and I went, but it was the same sort of disgusting display." By then, Abu Ammar knew better than to attend theological debates. Muslim philosophers, mathematicians, physicians, and astronomers all made notable advances in their fields, and their works were translated into Latin, and often into Hebrew as well, and studied in Europe. The West, in contrast, was small, poor, backward, divided by schism and heresy, disputed between two emperors, and for a while 2 or even 3 popes. From the second half of the 8th century to the end of the 11th century, Arabic was the scientific, the progressive language of mankind. A visitor from outer space who would have surveyed the world's societies at that time would certainly have concluded that Islam was the most likely to dominate the world for many centuries to come. Two schools of Islamic philosophy, Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites, which were to have a crucial influence on the course of Islamic history, developed at that time. Mu'tazilites were rationalists who adopted many of the features of classical philosophy. They believed in the ability of humans to arrive at knowledge and truth by combining revelation and reason, and that God's actions are founded on justice and reason. The Ash'arites believed that the only source of knowledge and truth is revelation, the Qur'an. To claim that mathematical knowledge is true, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4, is to put mathematics on the same level as revelation, and this is obviously heresy. Only religious knowledge can be truly true. The dispute between the two schools centered on the following issues. Mu'tazilites believed that Allah is just, and so is obliged to keep his promise in the Qur'an to reward the righteous and punish the wicked. Ash'arites countered that Allah's will and power are unlimited and absolute. Allah is not obliged to do anything. He is under no obligation to keep his promise, to reward the righteous and punish the wicked. He can just as well punish the righteous and reward the wicked. Ash'arites believed that the Qur'an, like Allah, has always existed. Therefore, every word in the Qur'an is eternal and cannot be challenged or reinterpreted to mean something it might not have meant at the time it was revealed to Muhammad. As the Qur'an was not created in time, it can never be abrogated, only interpreted. But the gates of interpretation have long since been closed. Mu'tazilites believed that the prophecies in the Qur'an were created when the angel Gabriel dictated them to the Prophet Muhammad. To believe, as the Ash'arites did, that the Qur'an had always existed meant that the words and actions of people as related in the Qur'an had been predetermined even before the creation of the world, and that those persons had not freely chosen those words and actions. And this brings us to the next point of contention. Mu'tazilites believed that people have free will, that they can freely choose their words and actions. Otherwise, it would be unjust for Allah to punish them for their sins or reward them for their good deeds if Allah had compelled them to act as they did. And Allah always acts with justice. Ash'arites rejected free will. There is no human agency or free will. A person's actions are like a tree bearing fruit. Just as the tree doesn't freely choose to bear fruit, so a person doesn't freely choose his actions. To say that someone can freely choose his actions gives that person power, which detracts from Allah's absolute and unlimited power, and this is heresy. This denial of human agency, the idea that anything happens only because Allah wills it, produced in Islam a culture of fatalism in which people did not need to take responsibility for their own action. It was strange to be brought into such immediate contact with the disciples of fatalism. If we did not reach the point we were aiming at, God willed it. If it rained, God willed it. And I suppose that if they had happened to lay their hands upon my throat and stripped me of everything I possessed, they would have piously raised their eyes to heaven and cried, God wills it. Attributing all to the will of God renders human agency pathetically ineffectual, as Stevens demonstrates with an anecdote about two Turks who smoke casually after an earthquake, their safekeeping entrusted to Allah, before being crushed by falling rubble. Mu'tazilites believed that Allah had created laws of nature, that events have effects, that they cause other events. For example, if someone brings a flame into contact with a piece of cotton, the cotton will catch fire. Ash'arites rejected laws of nature that would limit the absolute and unlimited power of Allah to do whatever He wants, whenever He wants. Events happen because Allah wills them to happen, not because some imaginary law of nature causes them to happen. So how is it, for example, that cotton always catches fire when it's exposed to a flame? Here is one of the most striking tenets of Ash'arism. At every moment, Allah destroys the world and then immediately creates a slightly different world in its place. When the flame is brought into contact with the cotton, Allah destroys the world and immediately recreates it with a slight difference. In the newly created world, the cotton is on fire. It's not the flame that causes the cotton to burn, but Allah's decision to set the cotton on fire. This idea was clearly expressed by the eminent Persian Sunni Muslim theologian Abu Hamid al-Ghazali in his 11th century critique of Aristotelian science, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Let us then take a specific example, namely the burning of cotton, for instance, when in contact with fire. For we, Ash'arites, allow the possibility of the occurrence of the contact without the burning, and we allow as possible the occurrence of the cotton's transformation into burnt ashes without contact with the fire. The Mu'tazilites, however, deny the possibility of this. We say the one who enacts the burning by creating blackness in the cotton, causing separation in its parts, or making it cinder or ashes, is God, either through the mediation of His angels or without mediation. As for fire, which is inanimate, it has no action. For what proof is there that it is the agent? They have no proof other than observing the occurrence of the burning at the juncture of contact with the fire. The 13th century Christian philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas had this to say about Ash'arism. The latter position, Ash'arite, is the mistake of those who believe all things follow without any rational plan from God's pure will. This is the error of the exponents of the law of the Moors. As Rabbi Moses Maimonides says, according to them, it makes no difference whether fire heats or cools, unless God directly wills it so. These are Maimonides' words on the subject. Regarding these ideas, one can only say, in my view and in the view of any intelligent person, can you fool him, God, as you fool men? For Aquinas and Maimonides, the source of creation is knowledge and wisdom. For al-Ghazali, it is will and power. Knowledge and wisdom have an inherent order. Will and power do not. In the end, the Asharite position won out for two reasons. It was defended by the clerics, who were a powerful conservative force, fiercely opposed to the intrusion of foreign, especially Greek, ideas into Islam. It was congenial to the caliphs because it relieved them of responsibility for their own actions, and also because they admired the idea that Allah's will and power were unlimited, unstoppable, and inviolable, and they wanted the same for themselves. After the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, who had to engage in a fierce struggle to secure his power, had lured one of his rivals to his palace and had him murdered, he had the head thrown to the crowd of the victim's followers in front of the palace, who awaited his return. Then the caliph had it announced to them, "The commander of the faithful has killed your leader, as it was foreordained in God's inalterable decree." Naturally, one could not resist God's decree, whose mere instrument the caliph was. Asharism, despite its bizarre premises that run so counter to common sense, became the dominant school of theological thought within Sunni Islam, and remains so even today. If you're skeptical about whether a theological dispute can bring down a thriving, successful civilization, consider these points. Many, if not Orthodox ulema, contend that the prediction of rain lies outside of what can lawfully be known to man, and between 1983 and 1984, weather forecasts were quietly suspended by the Pakistani media, although they were later reinstated. After the major scientific contributions of Islam's golden age in the 9th to the 13th century, science in the Islamic world essentially collapsed. No major invention or discovery has emerged from the Muslim world for over 7 centuries. The figures for translated books are also discouraging. The Arab world translates about 330 books annually, 1/5 of the number that Greece translates. The cumulative total of translated books since the Caliph Mamun's time in the 9th century is about 100,000, almost the average that Spain translates in 1 year. In earlier episodes, we noted the factors that enabled the radical transformation of the West. None of these factors was present in Islamic society. In the West, the ideals and values of classical culture were tolerated alongside, not in place of, but alongside of Christian ideals and values. In Islam, ideals and values foreign to those of traditional Islam and Arabic culture were rejected outright. In the West, the Catholic Church was perceived as corrupt by both rulers and common people, and many believed that over the centuries the Church had deviated from the original ideals of Christianity. In Islam, there is no institution that corresponds to the Catholic Church. A corrupt religious figure is not proof of a corrupt Islam. It is proof only of a corrupt individual. Also, there is no theoretical distinction between the civil and religious power. The West was highly fragmented politically into numerous competing jurisdictions with different languages, laws, and religions. In Islam, though the monolithic Islamic Caliphate soon broke up, Muslims continued to share a common culture and religion. In the West, political fragmentation and religious and economic competition drove exploration and innovation. Islam rejected all innovation and its clerics were determined to freeze Islam exactly how the clerics imagined it had originally been. The Prophet Muhammad had said, "If anyone introduces an innovation or gives shelter to a man who introduces an innovation in the religion, he is cursed by Allah, by his angels, and by all the people." He also said, "The worst things are those that are novelties. Every novelty is an innovation. Every innovation is an error, and every error leads to hellfire." Novelties were rejected not because they were false, but because they were novel, they were new, a breach of custom and tradition, respect for which is reinforced by the belief in the finality and perfection of the Muslim revelation. It was not the loss of trade routes or any other external factor that brought about the decline of Islamic civilization. It was the refusal to adapt to new ideas, to anything new, to believe that the world would never change, and that what had brought prosperity and military success 1,000 years before would continue to do so forever. It was that brought about the decline. Please join me in future episodes where we'll be examining in detail individual areas like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women's rights, and others. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.